Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today for a webinar on inclusive language and cultural awareness. It's been a pleasure to have a panel of great experts today to come and help us discuss this really interesting topic. As a cross-cultural consultancy, Creative Culture's role throughout the years has been to advise global brands on how to best communicate and strategize across borders, and how to bring cultural differences into an opportunity and competitive advantage for our clients. It is therefore no surprise that language in general and inclusive language in particular has always been a passion. And here again, we've been working hand in hand with clients to find better ways to be inclusive of differences and to demonstrate how this can become an asset to a business, to people in general, and to teams. To get started, Jen, I guess the first question will come to you, the first on the list. And obviously we've been working together for a few years, and I understand that your main focus to date has been around gender inclusivity in language. What was the main driver behind this decision?
Our corporate culture really is about care and inclusion. And we had a Change Starts Here initiative begin last year from our DE&I group within the company. And it relates to who we employ, who we support, and who we partner with. And so there's been a large drive within the company to incorporate DE&I even deeper into the organization. And so for us, this gender inclusivity within our language work was just a natural step towards that, and bringing that into the work that our team does. So it's taken us a while to get where we are today. I know you've been working with us as well as some other vendors on developing our guidelines for gender inclusivity. And so it was the culmination of many conversations, many different groups, many different people internally, externally, to fine tune where we are today. And I see it just as a starting point. Gender inclusivity is one facet of it. But for us, it was one that was the most obvious because of the gendered languages that we work with, specifically the Romance languages. If you're familiar with the French Academy, the Académie Française, they're very particular about maintaining, I don't want to say the status quo, but just sticking to the historical usage of terms in French. And so when you look at countries like Canada, for example, they have been historically a little bit more progressive with their French. They've incorporated inclusive terms such as feminine terms for writer or author or doctor, more in advance than what has happened within the country of France. So different cultures have taken different approaches, but I think when you deal with governmental agencies that have these norms and standards, there is a little bit of pushing that boundary or trying to be more progressive in order to stay with the times.
I understand that you tackle very sensitive topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion that relate, for example, to LGBTQ plus groups across countries like Nigeria or Saudi Arabia, where not only there are cultural biases, but also legal restrictions. What's your experience and how have you tackled that through language?
This is extremely difficult, right? I speak a lot. So we don't have an ERG for LGBTQ plus in our market area because it's so sensitive, but we have ERGs across the globe. So I talk a lot with them. What can we do in my market area? What can we do to support our colleagues? And what I've learned is that there's sometimes just very simple things we can do to still make sure that everyone feels included, but that we protect people. So I can give you one example. We did a survey recently where it was a global survey and we needed to know the gender because it had an impact. And then it's the question, binary, non-binary, how do we ask this question? And there's such a simple solution. Instead of giving people options, you just say, state your gender. Right, and then it's absolutely up to them. And no one who sits in a country where there is 100% strictly only binary gender doesn't feel suddenly, what is this, right? And it allows people. It's a little bit more work in the background to clean this up or to understand the data, but this is so worth it.
Christopher, one thing that I find really interesting is how you're pushing the awareness effort not only to internal stakeholders as well as customers, but you're also doing it, and I'm aware from my conversations with your team, also with your suppliers and the supply chain. Can you tell us a bit more how that works and the training effort behind that?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned before, it's really about that partnership between, our group in marketing and D&I. And so it begins really understanding, what is D&I strategy? And for us at Alcon, it's fostering a culture of inclusion. It's growing diverse talent, and it's also strengthening impactful connections. And that's really where we get into the priorities around building that network, building that framework for increasing our resources and our commitments to supplier diversity and supplier inclusion, and thinking purposefully about that, who we work with and why we work with them, and just really ensuring that we're all at the same level in terms of our focus around diversity and inclusion. And in many cases, with our training, we invite them as well to come along with us in the training, and so that we're on this journey together. And I think that that's really what it's about. It's about growth from an organization perspective, growth from an individual perspective, and then also growth as a collective, together as we try to do really inspired work that is diverse, but that is also inclusive.
Another point that is interesting, and again, I open the floor to any of you to answer, is intersectionality. So obviously one of the founding principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion really stands into this intersectionality and being able to tackle that. And someone in the attendees was talking about, standing on eggshells and, in a way, how do you ensure you're not diluting your message, trying to be intersectional and be inclusive of all different people and situations? Does any of you have any thoughts on this?
And I think this came up internally. We had a stakeholder who was a little concerned about the inclusive work we were doing, and if we're speaking to everyone, then we're really speaking to no one. So I think that is the feeling, but like everyone here said, it is about creating awareness. We're not here to tear down the language and make it sound worse than what it does. We're trying to take it to a different level. And so a lot of it does get very technical when you look at a phrase, perhaps, that you're turning it from something that's masculine, because that's the default, to something that's more inclusive. It's all about the syntax and the terminology and the play with the words that you do. You can make it so that the message is still just as strong without being diluted. But it is an art. And I think, that's where transcreation agencies come into play, because it is something that takes that talent and that finesse to make sure that you're not diluting the language as you integrate all of this new approach.
Looking at cultural diversity specifically, I'm turning to you, Anna, now, all the way from Brazil. Can you tell us a bit more about what inclusivity means in a country like Brazil, and how you feel culture and language are very closely intertwined?
Like most languages in the world, Portuguese is gendered. So our nouns are male or female. And we use the masculine as the generic. So when I want to translate board of the directors, I'm going to say direção ou diretores. Diretores is a masculine word, right? Because we use the masculine as the neutral. And several linguistic studies in gendered languages, not only in Portuguese, they show that when I say diretores, people will picture a group of males, not a group of males and females. And we need to be conscious about this, because we are erasing on our daily communication, we are erasing women and non-binary people.
Talking about the language specifically, I think it's an interesting one. Languages evolve in history, right? And they always have, and they always will. And when you see different countries that speak the same language, you can see the languages evolve in completely different directions. But yet it feels like with the inclusive language sort of effort and awareness, there is more reluctancy about making those changes. Why do you think that is, Anna? And what's your experience with it? Do you have some examples you can share?
Oh, yeah, many. I think this is the main challenge we face in implementing the inclusive language policy in gendered languages, is because people associate that with made-up words, because we have the neopronouns, and so they think it's made-up words, as if words weren't all made up. Well, right? So people tend to just reject that. They don't think about it. Oh, it's made up. Let's reject that point blank. And it is something that is fascinating to me as a cultural consultant and a linguist, because language evolves over time, and it has done that ever since language existed, right? There's a book by linguist John McWhorter. The book's called Words on the Move. And there he brings a concept that I find excellent to explain this. He says that one of the hardest things for humans to shake is the idea that language is, when in fact language is something that is always becoming. It's always changing. We don't say thou art anymore. Nobody here says that. And we don't bat an eye. We say you are, and it's good. It's all great. And when we reflect on that, we have to have a little bit of empathy, not a little bit, a lot of empathy with the people we are talking to. And I think that it's very important, I feel, is to explain that we're not destroying the language. Languages evolve. It has always been like that. It will always be like that. It's like trying to stop the planet from spinning. We're not going to.
Looking at tools specifically, and I open the floor to everyone, there was a question from one of our attendees around dictionaries and thesauruses and glossaries. What's your experience, Jennifer, Christopher, Caroline, in implementing those? Have you done this? Is it something you're finding is having a real impact and it's useful?
One of the things that we did is in our training, we created kind of I don't want to say a cheat sheet, but kind of a one-pager. And it's really all about asking a couple of questions, and kind of understanding, well, what is non-inclusive language? Well, it's when you're excluding or you're excluding an audience, you're maybe saying something that's offensive. And the question is how can we tell if language is non-inclusive? And so there's a number of questions here that we worked on and said, well, does it make a group of people sound less than? Does it paint a group of people in a negative light? Does it have any sort of racist or sexist connotations? Would somebody find this offensive? Is the language gender neutral? So these are, kind of a starter list of questions that could be asked of words, frankly, to evaluate, where are we, to have those conversations. And people may feel differently about the answers to some of these, but again, it really goes back to having those important conversations, having a dialogue about it, and building up that awareness. But I would suggest that that's one way, is simply by questioning it, and having these lists of questions handy. At the ready, and it's a lot better in my mind than having a long, list of words. But then over time, you've kind of started to train your mind. How might that be offensive? And as I've gone through the training, just working with different colleagues, eating, drinking, having lunch, things like that, you start to hear things, and you're like, wow. By the way, you might not want to use that phrase anymore because some might find that offensive, and so those conversations are really happening. But it really takes a little bit of intent to bring up that awareness. So I thought that was an excellent question.
When it comes to terminology, because we've been retroactively going back and changing some of our digital content that's live, we have developed a short list of terms to update our glossaries. And that's just terms that today, as they stand, changing member perhaps in Spanish where it was masculine to something, to the new version of the inclusive word that was chosen. So knowing that we use guest, member, customer, these nouns throughout all of our content, we do have a short list that we've committed to for the time being, knowing, like Anna said, that they do evolve over time. So it's something that does need to be maintained and constantly gone back to update, to make sure that you're staying with, moving with the rest of your content.
So going back to the measurements, how do you measure the impact of inclusive language on talent acquisition and retention, which is your area? Do you have some data, some examples?
Yeah. So in general, it's quite hard to measure, right? Because as a company, you run so many programs. So what do you use? We have a survey, an employee survey twice a year, where we of course ask about belonging and someone feels they're being discriminated, etc., etc. But that is so hard to measure. Can you pinpoint this to this or that? But I can give you an example, and it's great because people were already discussing this in the chat. In recruitment, we started using an augmented writing tool 2 years ago called Textier. And we could actually see that using a tool to write your adverts and improve your adverts had an impact on, so we did we look in text. Let me just explain. So Textier uses augmented writing. The recruiters or whoever has a job advert, and you can do the same for employer branding or anything you have, you basically put into the software. It works a little bit like Grammarly, and it just shows you where you should use different words. So you have this ninja, for example, in software developer adverts, where it says, maybe this will attract the more men, right? More the male audience. Or if you say, for example, this might be more for women. Do you want the balance? We do the same for generations. So we want to have a balanced approach. So we've been using Textier, and we saw an improvement in, I can't tell you the exact numbers, unfortunately, I'm not allowed to, but we saw an improvement in applications going up from women.
Perhaps I'll go through each one of you so that you can share a piece of advice with people who are watching us.
I think, again, it's all about a conversation. It's all about growth, I think, and we really need to step back sometimes and challenge ourselves and step out and, really ask ourselves questions. How can I be more inclusive? How can my work be more inclusive? How can I drive that, and really begin with yourself, but through action, not simply kind of just thinking about it, but really just going for it, getting out there, getting into different groups. If you have ERGs, join the ERGs, one that you might not think is particular to where you are. I mean, you could be an ally, it doesn't matter, but really challenge yourselves, get out there, find a colleague in a different department, ask them questions, learn more about their work, really challenge to get yourself out, because it's going to create new perspectives proactively for you that are going to help, as you move forward, because I believe that this is critical for everyone as we learn and we grow. So that would be my advice. So thank you.
With no pun intended, I would say to be inclusive as you're talking about inclusivity. So I think one of our big challenges was, as we made these decisions about what words to use or which way to go with a certain language, it was a very inclusive conversation that included so many different people internally and externally. So no decisions were made in a silo, and some of them became essentially negotiations or conversations about which way to lean. And to really pull in all of those key members that you need to talk to, all those stakeholders, to make sure that everybody has that buy-in and that voice in the process. And for us, that even extended to teams like digital or development, because some of the changes that we're choosing to make to our language content does impact some of their work. So it is very encompassing, and just so to keep that in mind as you pursue this.
I think that the one thing I can tell, especially anyone in corporate here, is that you do not have to roll out something immediately across the entire globe, right? I told you about Textier. We started Textier with a small pilot that we just tested. So experiment, see what works, and then measure it, right? Does this make sense? And maybe this will also then help your senior leadership to be more willing to do things. And again, it doesn't need to be investment. It could also be investment of your time, your projects, etc. So experiment, start small, see what works. If it doesn't work, move on, do something else. And then just from a personal perspective, and this is also what Chris was saying earlier, I think it's so important that we are allies, right? And if we see something, that we just speak up. And it's not necessarily pushing back or pointing people out and say, you can't do this, but just change the wording and make sure that when you respond, that you use the right term, right? Without obviously calling people out.
So my one piece of advice would be really to tailor the strategy to each country. Because even if you have a global strategy for inclusion, that's wonderful. But if you're going to talk in Spanish from Spain, it's very different than talking in Spanish from Uruguay, from Argentina, or from Mexico, Portuguese from Brazil or Portugal. It's very different. So it is very important to have the local teams included in the conversation to create strategies for each local market that will definitely increase the chances of acceptance and reduce resistance a lot.